Hello friends, and welcome to another Before You Read lecture. This Before You Read lecture is on Psalms 90 through 106, which is known as Book 4 in the Psalter. So this is Book 4 of 5 in the Psalter. Book 4 in the Psalter is also a relatively short section of the large book of Psalms. There are only 17 Psalms included in this book of the Psalms. And one of the first things that you may notice is the general lack of superscriptions or attributions to or references to the supposed author. So it's a very interesting set. A number of them will have no notes about who they are written for or from, or none of the superscriptions that we've come to pay attention to earlier in the book of Psalms. There's a general dearth of them. There are exceptions to that, but that's one of the first things you will notice, I think, about Book 4 in the Psalms. There are, I think, a number of recurring themes. At least I discern some themes in these Psalms. I think the first is the kinship or the kingship of God, the rule of God. God sort of functioning in the role as king is emphasized in many of these Psalms. Scholars identify Psalms 93 and Psalms 95 through 99 as especially especially germane for this type of thinking. We really see the idea of God as king in these Psalms. But as you read, I'm guessing you'll see other themes or motifs related to God's rule or God's being king. A second theme, perhaps a little bit less pronounced, but still present in a number of these Psalms, is this sort of tension between divine permanence and human transience. So there's this idea that God is steadfast, God is unmoving, God is permanent, but humans or human institutions or human life is transient. It's limited. It is even sort of moving towards decay in its very nature. And so that would be a second sort of theme to these Psalms. A third, again, not probably limited to Book 4, but one that stood out to me as I was reading, is the idea of God's role in creation, oftentimes being paralleled with God's faithfulness to Israel, or God's bringing justice or protection to Israel. So there's almost the sense in which God is known through creation, and God is known by being a trustworthy covenant keeper. And a fourth theme that you might keep your eye out for is the theme of justice. Who establishes justice and who doesn't would be a way of thinking about it. There are a number of interesting Psalms that you might sort of focus in on. I think that Psalm 92 has an interesting echo of Psalm 1, which is the book's opening. Psalm 95 I would describe as a bipolar psalm. It starts with this elaborate and beautiful praise of God, and it moves into a sort of warning, a warning about having the disposition of a former generation of Israel. It seems as though Psalm 96 and Psalm 97 can almost be read as a counterpoint in which all of the earth is praising in both of them. But in Psalm 96, the nations gather in that praise. But in Psalm 97, it's actually more negative. The other nations, or at least those that worship other gods, are put to shame or vanquished. There's some really interesting parallel or paralleling of material in Psalm 104 and 105. You might compare these. Both praise the mighty works of God. They both celebrate God's activity, God's working in the world. but they do so from very different perspectives. And I'll leave it to you to figure out what those different perspectives are. And then Psalm 106 also maybe a bipolar psalm. It offers both some beautiful praise and also a sort of a running list of all of the ways that Israel has been faithless, a sort of confession of shortcomings in the history of Israel. As you read, I invite you to consider 4 sort of themes or questions that I think are important. The first is, what does it mean that God is king? Right? If this is a theme, if God's rule is a theme in book 4 of the Psalms, you might start thinking and exploring, what does that mean? What does that mean for Israel? What does that mean for creation? What does it mean for other nations? So what does the kingly nature of God mean? The second is, what do you make of the relationship between God's wrath or God's anger that is discussed and mentioned several places in book 4 and God's steadfast love? What is God's wrath? How does God's wrath relate to God's steadfast love? And how do you see that relationship, especially in these Psalms? A third question or area to consider is whether or not book 4 of the Psalms supports a notion of God's universal relationship with all of humanity, whether it sort of sees itself welcoming and embracing the nations of the world, or if it's more standoffish, right? What is the relationship between God and the other nations of the world? Finally, I noticed that these Psalms speak more, or at least more explicitly, about the wicked. And so what are the wicked, or who are the wicked? How are they described? What makes a person wicked or righteous, right? According to these Psalms. I think that this is related to the question about enemies in the earlier books of the Psalms. But the wicked are particularly pronounced, at least in my reading this time. Well, book 4 offers us, I think, a lot to think about, a lot to discuss, and hopefully not a too demanding reading load either. So thank you so much, as always, for your time and your attention, and I look forward to hearing your own thoughts about this part of the Psalms.